Hey guys! So today I'm going to be doing a poetry talk video. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite poets ever, Conchitina Cruz. So when I started this poetry talk series, I was very conflicted about whether or not I would start with Mark Strand. Because Mark Strand is sort of, he's a great poet. I think that my last video really sort of was enough to show that I absolutely love him and his body of work. But the thing is that Mark Strand sort of falls into that very typical and also very problematic thing, which is that when we talk about things like poetry and art and fiction, literature, philosophy, blah blah blah, we always tend to discuss the work of people who are dead and white and male. And my dear Mark Strand is dead and white and male. But still, I felt like it would still be a good idea to start off with him because his body of work really is great, and I figured that I would just make up for that by talking about more of my favorite female poets from all over the world. So what better place to start than with somebody from my own homeland, somebody who lives in the same city that I do, who is brown, alive, and female, Conchitina Cruz. Her body of work has a very special place in my heart because reading Conchitina Cruz's first collection was what got me into writing prose poetry, or tiny stories, whatever you want to call whatever it is that I write. Yeah, I think that up until I discovered her work, I felt like the things that I've been writing were garbage just because they didn't fall into a set category. Like, I don't think they were condensed enough to be considered traditional poetry, but also they weren't narrative driven enough to be considered fiction. And before discovering her work, I really didn't feel like there was anybody to read that would give me some sort of education in that, especially coming from the Philippines or coming from somewhere that isn't the West. Of course, there's like Gertrude Stein and stuff like that, and her experiments with form will always be interesting, but at the same time I was sort of looking for somebody from my background, somebody that would be able to talk about the places and the things and the situations that you would talk about coming from the Philippines. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about her 3 full-length poetry collections. She also has some other chapbooks which I own, but I decided not to include them in this because a lot of the work in that overlaps with work in these collections anyway, and I just feel like these are better representations of her body of work. The first book that I want to talk about is Dark Hours. This was released in 2005, and this was the book that I first read from her. I picked it up in 2008 when I started writing for Malate Literary Folio. I was just a staffer and not published and had no idea what to do, and I was trying to look for people within sort of Philippine literature whose work I would like, because obviously I think growing up, especially if you grow up somewhere very post-colonial like the Philippines, the things that you read growing up are definitely very Western. I was very into like Diana Wynne-Jones and you know, J.K. Rowling, Brian Jacques, mostly fantasy, mostly by people from the West. And so when I got into college and started thinking about seriously writing or seriously consuming literature, I felt like I needed to read more people who were from where I am from, and that's still something that I struggle with today. And I found this in Power Books. For those of you guys who grew up in Alabang, you'll know that back then Power Books was wonderful, like a haven for books. It was huge, there were couches, people were encouraged to sit, and now it's like a school supply store, which makes me very sad. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked again. I love this collection. I really like the way that this collection sort of mashes together the elements of nature and forces of nature like storms and flooding, and sort of takes a cross-section of that and almost inserts it or creates a sort of bypass situation and plugs it into the urban setting, which honestly I think is kind of what Metro Manila is. For those of you guys who don't know much about the Philippines is largely agricultural. However, because we are very much still sort of influenced by the decisions of people from America and stuff like that, our government has sort of forced us to do this industrialization thing, or there's been a huge push for industrialization, even if our main industry really is agriculture. And I think what that's resulted in is that things get really, really wild because our cities aren't built for sort of that very industrial stuff, and yet that's sort of what we're doing. And so it floods a lot in Metro Manila, and I really love how this book talks about that because it's able to do it in a way that is very engaging and in a way that really makes you take a second look at the things that you see every day. So I'm going to read 2 poems from this. The first one is one called Dear City, and I actually have this framed in my living room because I'm a loser. So okay, Dear City, permit us to refresh your memory. What comes from heaven is always a blessing. The enemy is not rain. Rain is the subject of prayer, the kind gesture of saints. Dear city, explain your irreverence. In you, rain is a visitor with nowhere to go. Where is the ground that knows only the love of water? Where are the passageways to your heart? Pity the water that stays and rises on the streets. Pity the water that floods into houses, so dark and filthy and heavy with rats and dead leaves and plastic. How ashamed water is to be what you have made it. What have you done to its beauty, its graceful body and pictures of oceans, its clear face in a glass? We walk home in the flood and cannot see our feet. We forget to thank gods for their kindness. We look for someone to blame and turn to you, wretched city, because we are men and women of honor. We feed our children 3 meals a day. We never miss an election. The only explanation is you, dear city. This is the end of our discussion. There is no other culprit. So I really like how Dear City is able to talk about flooding and rain and sort of dissect the different elements of that and talk about the way that it behaves and talk about these very real issues while still very much utilizing metaphorical language. Now, while I really enjoy Dear City, the strange thing is that it isn't my favorite from this collection. My favorite from this collection is a poem called Geography Lesson. I feel like this next one is just the best when it comes to exploring symbols and melding together fiction, reality, and the way the two interact. I feel like it's able to also talk about the point at which the personal and the political create this sort of stir of conflict where sometimes it's very uncomfortable to accept that the things that you have to do as a person will affect the bigger picture. And I just love this poem. I love what it talks about and I love how it talks about it. So without further ado, Geography Lesson. Inside the story is a garden with a pear tree, the view of a house with a staircase and mahogany desks. Inside the house is a woman with her back against the windows, her body bent over her child inside a crib, her body leaning against the table as she fixes the fruit in a bowl. From the back of the room, somebody mentions foreshadowing, somebody makes distinctions between image and symbol, the board is filled with words. Inside the story is a dinner party the woman hosts, the idle talk of guests, the moment her husband leans toward the body of another woman. She watches her husband and this small gesture, the drawing room unable to contain her sudden knowledge. Inside the story, the woman turns away from the climax, turns to the windows and the pear tree outside, the symbol of her life, the tree in full bloom, the tree caught in shadows. We talk about the tragedy of false notions, the link between discovery and despair, the joy of understatement. When there is a knock on the door, a request to make a minute of our time, I say sure. We are inside the story, and to the students outside, I say sure. Come on in. What they pass around is a can, a sheet of paper, a request for loose change, and volunteers to dig for bodies. A few miles away, the residents of a dump site are dead, their bodies buried in an avalanche of trash. Inside the story, the woman cries, "What will happen to me now?" On the first day, the dying tried to raise their voices above the weight of their own tin roofs. The digging was slow, the voices stopped. Inside the story, the woman fixes the fruit in a bowl, apples, oranges, and grapes. She arranges and rearranges the fruit, draping the grapes on the rim, balancing the oranges on apples. The relatives need bodies for a proper burial. The can grows heavy. The students pause carefully upon the sheet and the others say, "Think about it. We have a booth on the 3rd floor. You don't have to sign up now." Inside the story, there's a woman, a house, a man, a pear tree. Inside the story is a house, a bowl full of fruit. Some students are braver than others. They write their names down. The woman leans the sadness of her body against the window, tries to look beyond the pear tree. Inside the story, she sees nothing but darkness. She is ungrateful for the luxury of despair. I love that one. I love how it was written 12 years ago, but it's still so friggin' relevant. Also, the story they're discussing, like the story the students are discussing in that poem, is an actual short story. I forgot the name of it just now, but I will link it in the description bar below. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about what is my favorite of these three collections. This is Elsewhere, Held, and Lingered. Another interesting thing that I want to say about Conchitina Cruz is that she sort of made the switch from traditional publishing to indie publishing, and I think that that's a huge thing for a writer of her caliber. In the Philippines, I won't dwell too much on this topic, don't worry, but the publishing industry is sort of shot because there's a monopoly over work, and I'm not just talking about sort of that one publisher not just that one publisher publishes everyone, but that only a set pool of people are ever published by the publishing house with the monopoly. And so it's just this ridiculous thing where nobody really finds a lot of relevant Philippine literature in mainstream bookstores and mainstream channels. The only publishing house that I can think of that is an exception to this is Visprint, because Visprint, they're famous for publishing Bob Ong, and I think I want to talk about Bob Ong in one of my fillet episodes, but like I said, that's a whole other video. Elsewhere, Held, and Lingered was the follow-up to Dark Hours, and this is when she made the switch to indie publishing. This is published by the Poetry High Chair, and they are an independent press that caters specifically to poetry. I'll leave their website below because they also have a lot of content that's just on the site. This is my favorite of all of her collections, and it's because I think that this one is a lot more playful than Dark Hours when it comes to form. As you will see, there's still some prose poems in this, but I feel like she was just so much more creative. Like, there are lists, there are some poems that are formatted like multiple choice questionnaires, and she also has some that are just all footnotes, and I just feel like as a craft project, this one is the strongest. Also, this employs a lot of narrative. It follows this arc where we follow a woman who is in a troubled marriage and sort of how she picks apart that trouble and talks about desire. It talks about finding other people to relate to. It talks about growing out of certain relationships, and it's just so freaking good. Another thing that I love about this book is that she tends to reuse certain titles, and depending on the poem that follows, the meaning of the titles change. It's so freaking amazing. I have so many favorites in this, and it's going to be so hard, but okay. This one is called Address to the Body in the Room. Let the music appease the unnerved skin, the skin about to squander its secrets. Let it seal the pores shut, let the brooding notes instruct you are here. Your hair still a swarm of digressions, midday heat, gate unnumbered and ajar, limbs of trees, let them slip off the strands, let them break into pieces indistinguishable from the monosyllables on the floor. There, on your neck, the litany of quick breaths. There, the wayward commute from your tongue to your stomach, you are here. Dismantle the hours, the vowels, the tangled paths. Discard the fingers that elsewhere held and lingered, the shorthand of saliva and sweat. Discard the mouth that elsewhere browsed and took in and swallowed. Dissolve the day that led to this instant lodged in your throat, you are here. Compose yourself accordingly and dance with the one you married. Last but not the least, we have her latest release. This was released in 2015, and this is There Is No Emergency. I think that compared to the other two, this one is definitely less tense of a read, if that makes sense. It's just as good, but it doesn't have that sort of, I don't know what you call it, that sort of urgency, or I didn't feel any sort of fear while reading this. And I know that's such a strange thing to say, but I feel like reading her two other collections really left me on edge and left me very, very emotionally distraught. Which in this case I think is a good thing, because that means that it's effective. I really like this as well, but I like it in a different way. I think that the slower pace of this sort of allowed me to linger more on the poems and really allowed me to just sort of soak them up more, because it didn't have that kind of push forward that the other two had, where I was sort of just always on edge and trying to figure out what the next poem would have to say about whatever the book was tackling. So yeah, from this I will just read one poem, and this is my favorite. This is an untitled poem actually. It's from the section in the book called Arrest. And okay. She held the sentence against the open window. Sunlight passed through, abduct and attack. Behead settled below a cable line on which perched a trio of birds. A pedestrian's head grazed close range, then civilian, then genitals. The sentence was news and the window was news. The sentence was fact and the window was aftermath. The sentence was fiction and the window was emergency. Smog traced the crevices of massacre. Carnage turned courage, turned garbage against the bobbing of leaves. I'll leave a link to the Facebook page of the Youth in Beauty Brigade, which is the indie publishing house that published this. And that's it for this video. If you guys have not read any of Conchitina Cruz's work before, then I hope that this video convinces you to check her out, because she's amazing. If you guys have, then please let me know what your favorite poem of hers is. Don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!